Okay, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. We were joined by Dr. Therese Cory, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Dr. Cory, I've engaged with your work a fair amount, and I've been deeply fascinated by it. I know a number of the podcast listeners have said, you have to get Dr. Cory on the show. You have to get Dr. Cory on the show. So we're finally doing it. Dr.
Great.
Cory is finally here, and we're going to talk about, the work you've done in philosophy of mind and St. Thomas Aquinas and Thomistic psychology and all that fun stuff. Huge topic. Obviously, you can't cover everything, but I'm excited to see where this goes. So yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Pat. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, before we get into all that stuff, give us a little background, if you wouldn't mind. What intrigued you about not just philosophy of mind, but also St. Thomas in general? I'd love to hear a little personal biography there.
Yeah, so I was a theology and classics major at Ave Maria College. That was my first foray into the liberal arts. And the theology program there was heavily influenced by Thomas Aquinas. So we read a ton of material from the Summa. That was one of the main sources that was covered in my theology classes. And that's really where I fell in love with the thought of Aquinas, probably initially because of the systematicity. Actually, I just found it so attractive that everything is broken down into these carefully delineated arguments and topics, and that there's a kind of map. So you just have this feeling of entering this whole world where any question that you have, there's another part of Aquinas' thought that might help you elucidate that. So that was really where I got hooked on Aquinas, and then I went to grad school for philosophy, recognizing that the theological topics I was interested in, it turned out the questions I always had about the Trinity or Christology, they always turned out to be philosophical questions about substance and existence and relation and things like that.
Right.
So that's how I got into philosophy in grad school. I went to Catholic U for my PhD. From there, I've just been delving more and more into the thought of Aquinas. I got involved with the Aquinas and the Arabs International Working Group, which explores the intersection between Islamic and Jewish thought and Christian scholasticism. And that turned out to be extremely formative for my scholarship. I mean, Aquinas is hugely influenced by these authors, and it taught me to read his thought in historical context and his sources. That's been a big part of my approach lately. So I've also gotten interested in a lot of recent debates around the mind and personhood in the earlier part of the 13th century, because I find that helps so much in understanding some of the things that seem very obscure in Aquinas' thought, some of the terminology that is technical but was taken for granted at his time, and you start to see how the debate was actually already set up in such a way that he's jumping into a set of questions that people are already asking.
Right. Yeah.
No,
that's awesome. That's amazing. Real quick, I just wanted to make sure we get the plug in early. Your wonderful book here, Aquinas on Human Self-Knowledge. This came out of your dissertation, is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Really great stuff. So I want to make sure we mention it again at the end, and people grab a copy of that. And I'm sure we'll be covering some of the themes in there. So yeah, thank you for that background. That's really helpful. So let's dive in, I guess, with fundamentals, because when it comes to St. Thomas, especially with his psychology and philosophy of mind, when I first read it, the thing that occurred to me, the one word that I thought was this is exotic, right?
Yeah.
And like, I eat a fair amount of exotic fruit. I also like exotic cats. So I guess it's not surprising that I was attracted to it. I guess I like exotic things. But it also seems like to not really fit particularly well in any of the sort of broad camps that we sort of encounter in contemporary philosophy of mind sort of situation, right? Of like the dualists over here and the reductionists and physicalists over here. So maybe you could just help us like give a broad overview or introduction to how Aquinas thinks about all this stuff. How would you describe a sort of the general project here, or the general Thomistic psychology or philosophy of mind?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, because I think there's this tendency, because Aquinas has this universal appeal and has been read for such a long time, there's this tendency to try to plug him into any problem we're having at any historical period and expect that he's got something to say about that. But we really have to be attentive to the fact that he's writing in a very specific context, and he's got his own paradigm and his own way of setting things up. That might not line up neatly with the kinds of distinctions that we make. So it takes quite a lot of work to put those two things in conversation with each other. And if we were to characterize what's typical of Aquinas' approach as opposed to more contemporary approaches, and I guess here I'll put in a plug for my current research project, which is exactly on this topic, in fact. He has this tendency to approach the mind and mental phenomena as in metaphysical terms, heavily metaphysical terms.
Right.
So these really, the way that he thinks about perception, intellectual understanding, these are actualities that are part of a broader metaphysical project of explaining how subjects take on new kinds of actualities that perfect them or derail them from pursuing their perfection. So the idea of cognitive phenomena as mere phenomena or as only appearances which we set over and against the world of real beings, that's a framework that emerged more in the 14th century, the late 13th century, after the death of Aquinas. And for him, the mental is a real part of the real world and needs to be analyzed in terms of the same kind of categories that we use for anything, for fire heating water or a tree growing to maturity, or the kind of the kind of changes in an animal that as it's pursuing its perfections, all of those are real changes, and the same is true of the mental for Aquinas. And one way in which that means that his theory is going to be very different from maybe contemporary approaches to cognition is that he's going to be less interested in how the mind hooks up. I'm sure you're going to want to talk about this more later, but how the mind hooks up with extramental realities. He's less interested in that as a fundamental problem for his theory of cognition. And he's more interested in thinking about cognition as a kind of perfection that we take on, like some kind of teleological completion for the organism that is the human being, which occupies both this sort of world of bodies, but also the intellectual world, and takes on these intellectual perfections and develops in those kinds of ways as well.
Yeah, that's a really helpful starting point. And you already hinted at some of the issues I think we want to try and talk through, because I mean, like, so much of debates around contemporary philosophy of mind and epistemology, they sort of hang under the specter of skepticism and radical skepticism, which, is kind of contemplating this mind world divide, if you will, this gap between mind and world. How do we close this gap, right? Or how can we know if we're like a representationalist, that we're representing things accurately? And as you know, and I'm sure many people know, like, radical skepticism is the stuff when I was younger, like, that's what kept me up at night. Like, those were the hardest things to answer, right? There's a lot of tricky philosophical problems, but that the radically skeptical stuff is it's really tricky, right? It's really tricky to get around that. So I don't know, maybe that is a good place to start, do you think? And obviously Aquinas, again, in his context, isn't dealing with that, but maybe he has some resources to help us think through some of these issues, right?
Yeah, so I think there's two things to say, just broadly structuring in terms of thinking about how Aquinas can help us here. So one of them is that, first of all, we have to recognize that he doesn't frame things in that way.
Right.
And that means that the kind of answer that he's likely to give might require us to fundamentally change our approach to cognition. I think that's the way that he's going to fit into the discussion. And then secondly, there's the fact that he's so one of the main selling points for Thomism in the 20th century has precisely been to set up the thought of Aquinas as an anti-skeptical kind of a bastion against skepticism, with the kind of worries that come out of Locke with representationalism, and Kant with it sort of remaining within the world of appearance. And Aquinas was supposed to solve those problems for us. And he's supposed to solve those problems, and this is the sort of standard 20th century narrative. He's supposed to solve those problems precisely because of his distinctive view of the intelligible species. So the intelligible species is, as you know, is a form that you abstract from your sensory experiences. So you're having sensory experiences of, let's say, I'm looking out my window right now, and I'm looking at this beautiful oak tree that's in our backyard. So I abstract this when I have that experience, such that I'm experiencing it as a tree and not just as presenting itself sensorially to me, that's because I've abstracted the form tree from my sensory experience, and that form, Aquinas calls it an intelligible species, and it forms my soul, and allows me to think about tree as such. And what Aquinas says about this form, so we might worry about this. We might say, well, okay, I've taken this is a kind of word. I've taken the form out of the thing and I've put it in the mind. And so now that it's in the mind, what am I knowing? Am I knowing the tree when I'm thinking about what trees are? Is my thought actually reaching out to that tree there or to other trees? Or am I just contemplating a form that's in my mind, which is just showing up to me as sort of internally?
Yeah.
And that would raise these sorts of skeptical worries. And so historically, people have said, and again, this is the 20th century narrative, they said, well, Aquinas actually has this wonderful way out of the problem because he insists that the form is merely that by which we know. It's not that which we know. What that which we know is treeness of those trees, but that by which we know is the form.
Yeah.
So the problem, as some recent literature has sort of pointed out, is simply asserting that doesn't actually help, right? It just simply
it's just an assertion
away of the problem.
Right? Right. And but somebody like Mortimer Adler was really big on that, for example, right?
Exactly.
But you're right. It's like, okay, you're asserting it. It seems attractive. I'll grant you that, but let's hear some more. Let's get some meat on this, right?
Tell me how it's supposed to get me
exactly
out there to the thing. Yes.
Right. Yeah.
So there's this tradition of reading Aquinas that wants to then say, well, it's because there's something special about the form. It behaves, you get a lot of metaphors. People say, well, it behaves like a lens. It behaves like a telescope. It's a pure sign, not having any being in itself, such that when you look at it, it forwards your attention onward to the thing so that you're able to grasp the thing in itself, because the form doesn't have any sort of reality of its own that your mind could stop there. It has to proceed onward to the thing. And I personally think these are interesting suggestions.
Yeah.
But they're not actually how Aquinas himself solves the problem. They trace back to later commentary tradition. So John of St. Thomas in the 17th century is someone who I think develops this idea of the form as a kind of pure sign. So all of these explanations are really focused on saying something special about whatever it is that corresponds to our talk of concepts or ideas. There's something that Aquinas calls an intelligible species. You got this special status, so that we're never looking at it. It somehow puts us directly in contact with the thing. That's fine as a philosophical theory. I don't find it very convincing, actually. But it seems to me Aquinas's view is actually really different and much more metaphysical. And for him, so if we take a step back and we ask, what's happening when I acquire this form from the tree in me? For him, that means that something is happening that's parallel to what happens when the tree generates a new sapling. So agents in Aquinas' metaphysics, they give forward their form. That's what agency is form communication. And so a tree in its activity brings forth something, a new thing in reality that is like itself, namely it is a tree. And Aquinas' metaphysics allows for agents to bring forth something of themselves in different modes of being.
Yeah.
So a tree can bring forth its own being in material being, and so that's bringing forth another tree, but it can also bring forth something that's tree in intellectual being, and that's tree thought, and that's a kind of agency.
This is exotic. I like it.
It's so exotic.
I love the exotic.
Yeah.
Wonderfully inflated and exotic. Yes.
Yes. So you just keep adding stuff to the metaphysics.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm all about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, then what happens is this is the point at which people want to say, but what do you mean it's a tree in intelligible being? What you must mean is that we have a concept that's about trees.
Sure.
And that is not what Aquinas means.
Mm-hmm.
He means it in a much more robust sense, that there's a way of being a tree that is a material way, and there's also a way of tree being that is an intellectual way. That's the texture of tree thought. It's like a new thing, a tree-ish thing that the tree brings about. And so then we might ask ourselves, well, okay, great, we've added all this stuff to our ontology, but where does that get us with a skepticism problem?
Yeah. So real quick. So Aquinas is already committed to modes of being, anyways. So this is really just another mode of being for Aquinas, right?
Right. Exactly.
Got it. Cool. Yeah.
And that's the key thing in his his metaphysics, which is going to actually make his philosophy of mind tick. Is that fundamentally he thinks that the formalities of reality are capable of being expressed in these different modes of being.
Got it. Yeah, very good. Okay, yeah, so back to the skepticism thing then.
Yeah, so then is that going to help us with the skepticism problem at all? Well, it's not going to help if what you want is a theory according to which the mind is sort of like a hand or an eyeball or something that somehow needs to reach out into reality and grasp something, do some sui generis kind of cognitive-y thing to get itself in touch with the tree. But that's not what Aquinas is. That's not how he thinks about cognitive relations. For him, the relationship between my tree thinking and this tree is a relation of likeness, right? But we say the same thing about the sapling and the parent tree. It has a relation of likeness. There's relations of likeness everywhere, and relations of likeness are just the result of certain kinds of causal activities, or per se agent causality. So he's not going to have anything. He's not going to have anything distinctive or sui generis to say about the mind's relationship to the world. There's no special. Here's what I want to say. There's no special mind-world relationship for Aquinas. There's simply the kinds of relationships that obtain between causes and effects. You have relationships of ontological dependence, and you have relationships of likeness and imitation. That's what we find in mental being relative to the beings in the non-mental beings that cause thoughts and perceptions in us.
Right. Yeah, no, that's really good and really interesting and helpful. So, and it's also just like wonderfully consistent, I guess, with how Aquinas thinks about things already. So let me ask you this. This is kind of a clarifying question for me. I'm not philosophy of mind is not my specialty. One of the people I've read aside from yourself on this a fair amount, my friend Jim Madden as well, but also Haldane and his formal identity thesis.
Yeah. Right.
Where are you, like, broadly in line with him? It's been a while. So some of the details are fuzzy of Haldane's account. But comparing and contrasting it with his might be just helpful selfishly for me to see where you're coming from, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think actually that he tends to fall more in line with the more standard 20th century Thomistic readings of Aquinas' intelligible species. Yeah. So the main worry, right, if what you're worried about in your theory of cognition is overcoming skepticism by getting you in contact with real things.
Sure.
And you're worried about the species getting in the way of that, right? The main question you're going to want to ask is, well, what's the relationship of the form in the mind to the form in the instrumental thing? And you're going to be especially worried if the answer comes out to be, well, there's two forms, right? Because it's going to look like now I've got a form inside that's going to block me from accessing.
Right. And then what if they don't match up? Right. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So in that case, the realist kind of, if we want to put us directly in contact, right? So if Haldane's an example of a realist interpretation of Aquinas, the solution is going to be to try to diminish the way in which those two forms are really two forms.
Right.
And so Haldane gets quite close. Of any interpreter, nobody's exactly going to say those two forms are actually just one form. Right?
Yeah.
Because everybody recognizes Aquinas says that there's two forms there, and so it's a kind of obstacle in the text. But he gets about as close as anybody does, Haldane and Joseph Owens, to saying that there's just one form, right? So they'll say, well, there's one form in two modes of being,
like two instantiations, right?
Form is in two places, like this sort of picture. And the way and how they works this out, I mean, in theoretical terms, in a very interesting and nice way, where he says that the form in the intelligible species in the intellect is not really a second instance of a new form. He says it's not like there's any extra thing there in the intellect. There's and I think that the tradition that he's drawing on here is this tradition of the form is pure sign that comes from John of St. Thomas. And that somehow, so what he says is that the form doesn't enter into a real composition with the intellect, and in the way that a real form would, right? And so that view, again, is really focused on trying to get the mental contact right by giving a special characteristic to the form that's in the intellect. And I think Aquinas's view, he's not interested in mental contact at all. That's not the way the theory goes with on my reading. What he's interested in is how does an instance of thought come to, what is an instance of thought, and how does it come to be in us? And the form is the formal principle. It's just as real as any other form. It's an intelligible form. It's a principle of intelligible being. That's a real kind of being in a genus of, it's a quality. And that form enters into composition with the soul and actualizes an instance of thought. And that has a relation of imitation to its cause, which was something like a tree or some series of trees acting through sense experience and imagination. So I don't know if that helps.
No, it does. It's helpful because I think it is important to always get the historical context right. I mean, Aquinas probably isn't, almost certainly isn't trying to solve brain and vat scenarios, right?
Yeah.
Now, whether he has the resources to help with that is, of course, an interesting question.
Right.
Right.
No, that's right. And so I think when we think about skepticism too, we can set it up in two different ways, right? One of them would be to say, well, look, how do we even know there's an extramental world at all, right? There's a kind of like sort of extreme version of the concern. And I think so I think Aquinas has something to say about that, but I'll come back to that in a minute. But the other concern might be to say something like, well, how do we know that our thinking is lining up with things as they are in themselves?
Right.
Right. So we're having experiences, maybe they're lined up with something out there, but how do we know that there's any real alignment? And I think Aquinas is, so one strategy, one philosophical strategy in response to that is simply to say, there's some special feature about cognition. There's something special, intentionality or, representation or something sui generis about cognition that counts as a kind of connection to things. And then we assess the connection. We say, how good is the connection? And is it really reliable? But Aquinas doesn't take that route because he doesn't think of cognition or the mental as being somehow set outside his philosophy of nature, part of his philosophy of nature. And so his answer to the question, like, well, what are our relationships and what secures our relationships to the outside? Well, it's the same kind of thing that secures the fact that a tree brings forth, the oak tree is going to bring forth new oak trees. So it's not going to drop a seed and all of a sudden it's going to come up as a sunflower.
Right.
There's patterns in the activities of things that trace to their natures. And it's that, and we might say, look, Kant is just going to say, where did you get that idea from that things act in accord with their natures according to these patterns of reliability? And so it's, if your skeptical worries are coming from that direction, I don't know that Aquinas has the resources to answer them. But if you're sort of allowing for general patterns of regularity, right? Those are the things that are going to underwrite for him the reliability of our perceptions,
right?
And thoughts.
Yeah, and I think that is really helpful because, through my years of staring at the ceiling, thinking about these skeptical issues, I've settled into a broadly Reedian epistemology and say, like, we're just kind of stuck with the innocent until proven guilty approach, right? Because I think it will just kind of be incoherent and self-defeating otherwise. And then, okay, we're stuck with this. Now, what are some of the best theories to help make sense of it, right?
Yeah.
And that's where I found that I'm really attracted to Aquinas there, not for obliterating the skeptical scenarios. I think for me, at least, that was done sort of independently. And then Aquinas's theories just kind of help fill in some of the theoretical details, if you will. And it sounds like, you kind of maybe think about it the same way.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, when I talk to my colleagues about Kant and they say, yes, but how can he be sure, about being, and then that these are the rules that being follows. I mean, I don't think Aquinas has something to say to that. But if you're going to roughly take for granted that, we can draw conclusions based on how things appear to us, and you have some kind of reliability in our cognitive powers, or even a kind of pragmatic approach, like these are the things, this is how stuff appears, and so we're just going to have to work with what we have. If you could sort of say it this way, if you can do science, then for Aquinas, whatever it is that you're taking for granted when you're doing science is going to be the same kind of thing that's going to give you some confidence in the activity of your of your mental powers. And what's nice about this too is that agency is not 100% reliable in the natural world across the board. And so the fact that what's underwriting our cognitive experiences is this broader picture of agents making patients like themselves, that's actually going to allow for a strong presumption of trust, but a defeasible one.
Right. Yeah. And that actually leads up to the next thing I wanted to ask you, right, is that I believe it was in Stump's very wonderful book, Aquinas, and I hope I don't misquote her since they don't want to check me. But she kind of raised a concern, which strikes me as like, given this sort of posture of Aquinas, the question maybe isn't so much how do we get things right, but how do we ever get things wrong? Right. Yes, it seems to be almost like a surprising optimism here, right? So it's almost like maybe the problem runs in the opposite direction. So maybe you could help us explore that. Now you already kind of hinted at the solution, which I think is a really good one, right? If we have this sort of this causal powers theory based on agency, and we already know that in the general run that isn't 100% reliable, but it is generally reliable, if not perfect. And that just kind of spills over to philosophy of mind and cognition, then it seems like we have a nice fit there. But maybe we could talk a little bit more about that, because that's, I think, an important point.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where I think the theory looks over optimistic if we mistakenly read abstraction as being a process of somehow magically zeroing in on the form in the image and just sucking the form out of the image and depositing in the intellect. And you think, well, look, the tree form's out there and now it's in here. Like, you either have it or you don't.
Right. Like, how could you ever be mistaken then?
You can't. Have any kind of disagreement about definitions or any of that stuff. It seems completely unrealistic. But once we realize that Aquinas is relying on this broader theory of agency and change, you can see he's got tons of discussion about how agents, the success of an agent's action is basically a function of the agent's power to change relative to the intermediaries that are used, the quality of the intermediaries that are used to change something, and then the receptivity of the patient. And so any of there's a sort of optimal situation in which all of them align perfectly and the agent's action reaches its teleological completion perfectly, but a lot of the time it doesn't, and so it's going to be partially successful. And that explains Aquinas' account of I think that it explains something that's really weird in Aquinas' account, which is that our simple apprehensions are always correct. You're like, well, how can they be always correct? Such an error only enters in with judgment. And the reason is that what's happening is that the tree out there, right? Suppose I'm very naive about plants and I never pay any attention to them at all, right? And then I go out there and I encounter this sort of growing thing in my backyard, and what's happening is as an agent, it's pressing in on me as a patient and assimilating me to itself. But because of my lack of experience, I'm not a very good receiver.
Mm-hmm.
And so it might only succeed in assimilating me to itself to the extent to which I sort of get it as, you know, a growing thing, or even a living thing, or maybe just some of that green stuff that's in my backyard.
Yeah, right.
Right? And that's all. That's all real, right? That's all something real about the tree, but it's very limited in its success in assimilating me to itself.
Right.
And so Aquinas has a very worked out theory of indistinct cognition, where he'll say that basically what's happening is that in some way, the things that are acting on our intellect are going to leave something of themselves at some level, right? But it actually might take a lot of work and training and experience to actually make yourself receptive enough to be able to be affected properly down to the last level, where you're fully assimilated to the thing.
Yeah, no, that's really great, and I think that this is what's so attractive about this position is it kind of gives us everything we want, right? Because we want general reliability. Otherwise, we're stuck in radical skepticism. However, we know that we make mistakes, right?
Yeah.
So we have to have room to explain how and why we go wrong as well. And so far, it seems like Aquinas has a good system for this, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we get that, I think, by moving away from a more logical way of thinking about acts of the mind. It is sort of like thinking of them as logical functions and thinking about them more as activities of natures.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, how thoroughly metaphysical all of this is. Right. Excellent.
Totally.
So, not to switch gears too quickly, but I would be curious how you might, and you can take whichever ones you want here, but there's obviously all these sorts of wonderful problems in philosophy of mind, right? We've just been hinting on some of them, right? And a few of them that come to mind are just, there's the hard problem of consciousness, right? There's the identity over time problem, right? How do we have that, right? If it seems like all of our parts are changing, that we still, that I'm still the same person I was when I just asked that question to you, right? That seems to be an issue. What are some other issues? The interaction problem, right? Famously, right?
It's the pineal gland. It's all the pineal gland.
It's all stuffed. Yeah, it's all stuffed in the pineal gland. So that one's actually been solved already.
Yeah.
But so my general question for you, Dr. Cory, is like, given like a lot of these contemporary problems in philosophy of mind, which really seem to be problems that are kind of wars between dualists and physicalists, like, well, you have this problem. Oh yeah, well, you have that problem, right? And then, well, yeah, but you got 3 problems. I only have 1 problem, right? when you look at that, right, coming from the perspective of a Thomist, like, are there any that really stand out to you and say, like, Thomas, at least maybe he didn't think about this directly, but he has some really good resources here that can help us think about these in a new light. Maybe tease some of that out for us if you don't mind. Right?
Yeah. So one that I've been thinking about a bit lately is the hard problem of consciousness, actually.
Yeah.
Because so the hard problem of consciousness is supposed to consist in some kind of explanatory gap between the observable mechanisms, physical mechanisms of, brain activity, and the experiential character of our mental life.
Right.
And so you're trying to get the experience, the quality, the phenomenal feel out of the physical stuff is really difficult. And I think so. One of the things that I think is super interesting about Aquinas' account of cognition generally is because of this metaphysical approach that he takes. I think he collapses the well, let me take a step back. It's sort of like when we're in this framework where you say, well, I'm looking at a bunch of physical mechanisms that are doing stuff, right? And then I'm having this experience on the inside that has an inside, right? And I can't see how the two things align with each other. One way of characterizing that, right, is there's some kind of a gap between the objective features of the mental and the subjective features of the mental. And Aquinas' account sort of what collapses those two things into each other and says, well, look, the what it is objectively to be mental is a kind of subjectivity, because objectivity is itself a kind of being. And so what he's going to want to say is that we shouldn't think about our conscious activities as having these parts to them, right?
Mm-hmm.
As though there's a kind of observable part and then an inner experiential part. In fact, the inner experiential part is the very stuff of experience. That's what experience is all the way through.
Yeah.
It's not experience has an inner part, an inner life, right? It is that inner life, and that inner life is the kind of stuff that we acquire when we're perfected as a kind of as the kind of organisms that we are.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So in a way, for him, I think that he's going to look at the hard problem of consciousness and say, okay, why are we trying to map these two things onto each other at all? Right? The question that we should be asking is something like this: what makes brain activities have a sort of potential for this kind of being that is realized in them, which is the very being of consciousness, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So for him, the problem is going to be formulated in terms of potentials and actuality, right? Not the observable and the qualia, right? Which are only detectable from the inside of the experience. Yeah. So sort of the result of all of that is going to be that he's going to want to he's going to want to push the problem back to a more fundamental problem about, which is going to require asking what kind of genre do these different kinds of realities belong to? So, if we've got a brain and the brain is doing stuff and the brain is a body, right? So we need a metaphysics to tell us what are bodies like? What are their essential features? What do they do? And then when we're looking at consciousness, that's another kind of being, right? And so the real work to be done is actually, in a way, he takes the hard problem of consciousness, he pushes it into the interaction problem. It's sort of how this is going to go for Aquinas. So one problem collapses into the other. And so for him, the problem is going to be, how do we explain that a body has a potential to acquire this kind of actuality as its own actuality?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And do you think, because the way I thought about this is, what I think is helpful, not just about Aquinas, but I guess a broadly Aristotelian view is, it's not, I guess, thinking of the dualist versus the physicalist. If the physicalist has a problem of saying, look, we've got all this fundamental physical stuff, right? That seems to be essentially the opposite of everything our qualitative experience is. It's not teleological. It's not about anything. It's not rational. And then somehow, boom, right?
Yeah, right.
We get it, right?
Yeah.
That does seem to be a problem, right? But then, the dualist seems to have this problem too of like, well, look, you guys have basic actions, and I do think we need basic actions and stuff like that at some point, right? But then, like, what's the point of even having a brain? What does a brain do, right? And clearly, I hit you over your brain or your head, and bad things happen, right?
Yeah.
So there's like this. There's obviously, if not outright reducibility, there's deep dependency, right? So and now you gotta give me some story of how this interaction goes. But I guess a Thomist, and this is kind of maybe what I'm getting from what you're saying, Dr. Cory, is like, well, there's just substances, and from the substances there are just inherent beings that have both of these aspects, where we can actually, I think, in a meaningful way, actually talk about emergence, right? But it's just so, I guess, metaphysically almost worlds apart from the way that these other camps are sometimes thinking about it. But to me, if you take a substance first view, that does seem to solve a lot of issues, right? Or at least would think about them in a very different way. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, that's perfect. I mean, I think thinking of it in substance first terms is really helpful, because it means that you're going to have a principle of irreducibility, which is going to go to, this is the kind of thing that it is, right? And that's maybe not super satisfying to us, because we don't want to stop with the nature of the substance. We want to break it down into some more minute parts, right? Like, so we're not satisfied to say, I'm explaining what's going on with this oak tree here in terms of its oak tree nature. We say, no, but we got to get it down to the molecular level, right? And that'll give us the real explanation. And for Aquinas, sure, that'll tell us some things about oak trees. It'll tell us some things about bodies as such, right? But if we really want to understand oak trees and what they're, then it's actually the nature itself is the appropriate stopping point for the explanation. And I think similarly, what we're going to have in the case of any cognitive being, is that we're going to have to say, well, look, what makes the brain the appropriate matter for imagination, right? Of course, he's not going to say that intellect is not located in the brain, but the imagination is, right? And that's responsible for an enormous part of our conscious experience.
Yep.
And if we say, yeah, but I'm trying to figure out what part of the brain or what specific functions of the brain, or what is it about the brain that makes it, he's just going to say, look, it's the kind of thing, it's the kind of matter that's capable of this kind of actuality. And at a certain point, the explanation just stops right there.
And if we could fully grasp the nature, we would see that, right? I think that's the idea, right? In the same sense that, like, to borrow a line from Descartes, like, once you fully understand what a mountain is, you understand why it includes valleys, right? And if you ask why do mountains include valleys, but you haven't really understood it, and I think Aquinas would say, well, look, this is going to be true of when in terms of explanations, if it isn't from an extrinsic source, it's going to come from a principle of its own nature. But that doesn't mean that we fully comprehend a thing's nature, but we can be confident that explanation is there, and we can keep searching and trying to understand, right?
Well, and it's sort of like other kinds of irreducibility. Like, for instance, if we're just operating at the level of body as such, right? Then we might ask the question, well, why does body have to be extended? And there's no answer to that question. That's the essential feature of body.
That's what it means to be a body.
It means to be a body, right?
Right. I like the term. Have you heard the term? There's a term. It's not a brute fact. It's an autonomous fact. And the idea is, it's not that it's unintelligible, but it doesn't make sense to ask why, right?
Yeah.
Why are mothers parents? Well, that's just what a mother is, right? Sort of thing. Yeah. So I think
part of the and we get that when we're sort of operating at a definitional level, right? Like, how could you even grasp the concept of mother without having the concept of parent baked into the concept, right?
Right.
But for Aquinas, he's going to push that to the metaphysical level also, right? Like, if you grasp fire, right, and then you ask the question, why does fire burn? Like, that's what it is. It's the kind of thing that it is, right? And it's lodged in it might not be obvious from the definition of fire. And that's the project of trying to understand these natures. But once you've sort of located the nature and its signature activity, then you're not going to be able to give any further explanation for why this nature is paired with that activity.
Yes. And I think this is, I really love that you brought this up, because to my mind, this actually helps us solve a lot of problems, not just how to think about the hard problem of consciousness, but even free will as well. Because if you just try to like make sense of free will in terms of the material components, you're going to have a lot of issues, right?
Yes.
Because it's either going to be deterministic or random. That's the classic objection, right? And both of these seem bad because fundamentally there's a lack of control. Right? A lack of control if it's deterministic, or a lack of control if it's random. But if you take a substance first view, that seems to me to allow for as much of a top-down story of causation as bottom-up, where no, we are substances with characteristic powers where we can literally exert control over our parts, maybe even particles in our brain, right? And that's just what it means to be a substance of that type of thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's where actually your comment about free will reminds me of the thought of someone who's often put in an opposition to Aquinas, but I think often isn't so much to the way that he's often portrayed, but John Duns Scotus. And when he's sort of pushed against the wall to say, well, why does the will what it wills? Where's the why? Give me the further explanation. He says, he just cuts off the discussion and says, this is a stupid question, because the will wills because that's the sort of cause that it is. It's a willing cause. It's just a free cause. He's like, this is like asking, why does fire burn? That's the kind of cause that it is.
Right. Yeah. I love that. Yves Simon was big on that too. He's like, if you're asking why Susie decided to play the piano rather than watch TV, you're always subtly begging the question and confused, because that's just what the power of the will is. It's the power to, what was his language? Always to grant the dignity to end deliberation, right? To make something efficacious, actually to make any motive efficacious. So he would say it's the wrong way around. It's not the motive that pulled. It's you that said, that motive, I choose you.
It's now
right?
going to be this motive that's operative. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's that. So yeah, it really does solve a lot of issues here, doesn't it? Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
You know, Dr. Cory, we had one question from the audience. Maybe we get your quick thoughts on here. And then I want to make sure we talk more about your book and some of your upcoming work before we go. And this is a famous one, so we had to get your comments on this. The immortality of the intellect, right? So our friend Callum says, does Dr. Cory think the arguments for the immateriality of the intellect entail, it's immortality, I suppose. It's activity after death. Given hylomorphism, it seems the necessary conditions might not be there. So the soup
I think it's a soul. This is soul.
So I was gonna say a soup. My youngest daughter loves soup, and she calls it foop. She calls it foop. But we're not talking. We're not talking about soup. We're talking about the soul. Would be
soul
inert.
Food.
It's soul food. Foop. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, big vexing. Obviously, can't cover all this in the last couple minutes here, but maybe just some general thoughts from your perspective on this one.
Yeah. No, this is a very important question for Aquinas' anthropology, and so the difficulty arises because he says that the activity of the intellect in this life is dependent on the activity of the imagination. So we're familiar with that on the inbound route, where we don't get any intellectual forms unless they come to us by the activity of material objects acting on the senses, which then act on the imagination, and from there come to form our intellects. Right. But there's a second half of the problem, which is that he also says not just inbound, but also outbound, if we think of attention as a kind of outbound directing of ourselves. We can't do any thinking if we don't actualize forms in the imagination at the same time. And so then we might think, well, that's not good for the separated soul, because we don't have a brain. The soul is separated, so we don't have imagination anymore. So now how's that activity going to work? And I think Aquinas gives what I think is his best answer to this question in the Summa Theologiae, in the Prima Pars question 89, Article 1. And there he says that what happens when the soul separates from the body is that it actually changes its mode of existence. So when it was informing the body, it not only is, but also has the role of a form and the status of a form. So in a way, he sort of is sort of distinguishing the characteristics that come to a thing from what it is, and the characteristics that come to a thing from its status. And so the soul sort of it's fully a form when it's informing the body. But once separated from the body, he said it takes on the mode of a separate substance. And the way to understand this is that he already thinks that a separate substance, namely an angel, is just nothing but a form existing by itself. That's what angels are. And so when we say, well, how does the soul is separated from the body. Now, what is it? It's a form existing through itself. But not through itself, by itself, right? No matter. So what Aquinas sees there, and I think is a really interesting insight, is that the soul remains the kind of thing that ought to form a body. But nonetheless, in this terrible condition that it finds itself inside, it's actually a bad thing for the soul in a way, because it's not a natural state for it to be in. But nonetheless, because of its immortality, it goes on existing when the body is dissolved. And so it takes on the status of a separate substance. And he says at that point, it begins to operate according to the mode of a separate substance.
Yeah, that's, again, wonderfully exotic. I love it.
It's so great.
Yeah, and not only that, but it seems to fit really well with evidence we have of like near-death experiences and stuff like that.
Yeah,
I would think.
That's true. Yeah.
Right. So it seems to have somebody like, well, this is just complete fanciful conjecture. Well, not if you take seriously some of the stuff that's come out of peer-reviewed research of NDEs and stuff like that, right?
Yeah. So really, what's happening is that the soul is angelizing, right? When it's
that's a cool way of putting it. Yeah, that's a really cool way of putting it. Yeah.
So what's good about that is then in an angelized mode, the soul begins to know in the manner of an angel. And how do angels know? They know simply by being irradiated by the divine light. That's their natural mode of cognition. And so what Aquinas says, and this is a view he comes to late in his life, and in the text that I've been describing, is that the soul is he begins to know according to the mode of an angel, but it does so poorly and indistinctly. So we do have cognitive activity after death, in the way that angels do, but precisely the reason why God made the souls embodied as opposed to the angels, which are not embodied, is that we don't handle our cognitive capacities intellectually do not handle that mode of cognition very well. So he allows that, in fact, the quality of our cognitive experiences after death are not as sharp as our cognitive experiences in an embodied state, because in an embodied state, they're actually, the point is put on them. They're sharpened by their association with the imagination, which we lack in death.
Yeah. Really, really cool response to that. So, all right, before we wrap up, Dr. Cory, can you maybe tell us a little bit more about this book and where the best place to get a copy would be, and whatever else you're researching, and how people can keep up with the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so the book, I think it's available on Amazon. It should be out in paperback now, so it's not going to cost the moon, which is good. And yeah, so the current research project actually is related to that, some of the discoveries I made in the book. So in chapter 6 of the book, I talk about how Aquinas's theory of self-consciousness is informed by this view that whenever I'm knowing anything at all, I'm somehow cognitively present to myself. And so the self-awareness is somehow provides a kind of framing to all of our conscious experiences. So I call that implicit self-awareness in the book. So the view is that all of our cognitions are implicitly self-aware, even if we're not paying attention to ourselves. We're sort of there within the very structure of the cognition. And after that, I started to think more carefully about the question, well, why would that be the case? And for a while, there's a tendency to formulate those kinds of claims in terms of higher order cognition. So I've got one cognitive act, and then there's necessarily another cognitive act that's directed toward the first one, and that's what's making me be self-aware all the time. But when I was writing the book, it was pretty clear that's not Aquinas's view. It seems like the self-awareness is actually built into the structure of our cognition. So I started asking myself, well, why is that? And that was what led me to the current project that I'm working on, which is going to be another book, tentatively called Knowing as Being in Aquinas, this metaphysics of the mind. And that's going to deal with the stuff that we talked about right at the beginning of our discussion about reconsidering his paradigm of cognition in terms of acquiring a certain kind of being.
Yeah.
So this rigorous metaphysicizing of his entire mental framework, and that's part of the thing I'm finishing up now that's holding me back, but hopefully it's going to be done very shortly, is trying to explain how that kind of being is intrinsically self-manifesting. So it's the texture of intellectual being itself that is self-illuminating.
Right.
And so any instantiation in it in us of it is going to be a kind of self-illuminating instance of being. So that's the picture. That's what's keeping me up at night these days.
Yeah, we all have to have at least something that does that for us, right?
Yes.
So, well, great. I cannot wait for that project to come along, and maybe it will give us another opportunity to have another conversation once that's finished up. That would be amazing. So I'll be sure to link the book and some of your other work in the show notes afterwards. But this has been a real treat. So thank you so much, Dr. Cory, for being here.
Thank you, Pat. This is just such a treat to talk to you.